I was once talking about speaking in tongues and explaining how I believed that that was only referring to foreign languages, and I had a sister in my congregation saying that tongues could also be some secret angelic language, so essentially something esoteric that could only be understood between you and God. And I actually got a comment about this where Paul seems to be saying this, but if we look at this full chapter in context, that's not what he's saying. First of all, I'd like all of us to be okay with the fact that the Apostle Paul speaks in hyperbole in many of his letters. If we read chapter 13 and the first few verses, not just the first one, it says, "If I speak with the tongues of mankind and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give away all my possessions to charity, and if I surrender my body so that I may glory, but do not have love, it does me no good." We can see clearly here that Paul is talking hyperbolically about two different things, and they are having the faith to remove mountains. We know that no one has faith to literally remove mountains, but also the fact that he's going to the extremes and talking about martyrdom, but still not having the love for other people. You see, the point that Paul is making here is that for one to speak in a tongue that no one understands, it would be an act void of love. In fact, what he's truly saying is that you'd be more like an irritant. So many scholarly works on the book of Corinthians cite the fact that when Paul was writing to the Corinthians, he was writing to an assembly of people rather than to the general public. And this assembly consisted of people that came from Europe, Asia, and Africa, primarily traders that spoke different languages. This is important to remember for when we move to chapter 14. And to solidify my point about Paul's use of hyperbolic speech, I will go to Galatians 1:8, which says, "But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse." Now, Paul wrote this obviously knowing that angels were not literally going around and preaching a different gospel. His point is that let anyone who is teaching a gospel other than what you've read in the scriptures, let them be accursed. Furthermore, let me just, to establish this point, remind everybody that tongues are just foreign languages in the book of Acts and also according to Revelation, and I'll even show you a verse in Daniel. Revelation says, "Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. When a person speaks French, we refer to them as French. When a person speaks Spanish, we refer to them as Spanish, and so on and so forth." Of course, this is also when they are native to those countries that speak those languages. The same is the case here when we read the prophecy of the coming Antichrist, that he will be given authority over people that speak a broad array of different languages. Here's another list of references showing that tongues are just other languages that humans can understand if they speak them. Furthermore, when Paul speaks of tongues, he's talking in the plural. He's not talking about one specific gibberish language that comes from heaven. He would need to use the singular if he was going to refer to a specific language. Furthermore, the Greek word for tongue is glossa, which is where we get our English word glossary. And to my awareness, there isn't a glossary of words that only angels can understand. It would also be foolish to suggest that when angels interacted with humans in the Bible that they were speaking some divine angelic language that they could not understand rather than speaking in their own tongue. If you read Genesis 19 and even plenty of other examples, when angels spoke to humans, they spoke to them in words that they could understand. And in order for the angel Gabriel to interact with Daniel, he would have had to interact in a tongue that they both could understand, not in some secretive esoteric language that only a few people in some cool club know how to speak. Now in chapter 14, this is where it gets spicy, because we see Paul says in verse 2, "For he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men but to God, for no one understands him. However, in the Spirit he speaks mysteries. But he who prophesies speaks edification and exhortation and comfort to men. He who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the church." I wish you all spoke with tongues, but even more that you prophesied, for he who prophesies is greater than he who speaks with tongues, unless indeed he interprets, that the church may receive edification. See, if a man is speaking in a tongue or in a language that only he understands, and that no one else in the congregation understands, he's only edifying himself. He's not edifying anyone else. But if he's operating in prophecy and he's telling people stuff in a language that they can understand, then he's edifying everybody. Verses 6 through 12 is where the important part comes in, because this adds the context. But now, brethren, if I come to you speaking with tongues, what shall I profit you unless I speak to you, either by revelation, by knowledge, by prophesying, or by teaching, even things without life, whether flute or harp, when they make a sound, unless they make a distinction in the sounds, how will it be known what is piped or played? For if the trumpet makes an uncertain sound, who will prepare for battle? So likewise you, unless you utter by the tongue words easy to understand, how will it be known what is spoken? If you're speaking a language that only you can understand and the rest of the assembly doesn't understand, you're not going to accomplish anything. For you will be speaking into the air. Exactly. This is what Paul is saying. You're just going to be wasting your breath. You're not going to be doing anything to help anybody else other than yourself. Just self-edification. And verse 10 is everything out of this. There are, it may be, so many kinds of languages in the world, and none of them is without significance. He says languages in the world. He's not referring to heavenly languages. He says languages in the world. Therefore, if I do not know the meaning of the language, I shall be a foreigner to him who speaks, and he who speaks will be a foreigner to me. So if I only speak English and somebody else speaks French, I'll be a foreigner to him, he'll be a foreigner to me, because there's a language barrier there. And Paul says in verse 12, even so you, since you are zealous for spiritual gifts, let it be for the edification of the church that you seek to excel. If you're using a spiritual gift like tongues, where you can speak in a different language, but you're not having an interpreter there, or you're not doing it so that other people can understand what you're saying, it's just useless. That's what Paul is saying. In verse 13, it says, therefore let him who speaks in a tongue pray that he may interpret. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my understanding is unfruitful. Again, Paul's not speaking of an angelic language. He's just saying that there's a spiritual element to tongues, because a lot of people were able to speak it without actually studying the language for themselves. It's like me evangelizing in French, even though I've never studied it a day in my life. Later on, Paul sets the parameters for tongues. He says in verse 19 and 18, I thank my God, I speak with tongues more than you all. Yet in the church I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that I may teach others also, than 10,000 words in a tongue. Paul is saying, I'd rather speak 5 words that are useful to everybody than 10,000 words that are only useful to me. And he says in verse 27, if anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be 2 or at the most 3 each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there's no interpreter, let him keep silent in the church. He's saying, either have someone that can translate what you're saying, or shut the hell up. He says in verse 39 and 40, therefore, brethren, desire earnestly to prophesy, and do not forbid to speak with tongues. Let all things be done decently and in order. Don't forbid the speaking of tongues, but if you're going to do it, make sure that it's used to edify the body and not just for your selfish needs. Because what Paul was saying is that if only one could understand what they were saying, that what they were speaking would in turn be just with them and God and not with everybody else. Because God can understand all the tongues. He can understand someone that prays in French and someone that prays in Spanish and someone that speaks in those languages. But everyone else in the assembly might not understand what's being said. This is one of the many traps that many Messianics fall into. Why? Because they believe in the Apocrypha, where the Testament of Job is a book in there, which I don't believe is part of scriptures, talks about an esoteric angelic language that actually exists, and I read that and it just reads like Narnia, so I don't trust those words because they're not God's words. Secondly, there are many that deny Paul, and then there are others that deny the divinity of Yeshua. And Paul said that people were uttering mysterious things in the spirit. It's that they were communicating spiritual things in languages that other people in the assembly could not understand. Worldly languages. And the flutes and pipes metaphor was about having someone to interpret what was being spoken in those languages. Be blessed.